Yeah.
Okay, once again, Art Wade with the Drug Policy Alliance. Just a little bit about myself. I was born and raised in Denver. My family's 5 generations on the east side of Denver. And just to give you an idea of what Drug Policy Alliance is about, we were an organization that initially in California pushed for diversion programs for nonviolent drug offenders. So that was Prop 36. That type of policy is now spread out throughout the country. So we were the first groups to say, you know what, why are we putting nonviolent offenders in prison simply for the choice of using a substance? We also fought real hard to limit the crack powder sentencing disparities that were going on across the country. At one point in time in this country, people who were caught with the same amount of crack cocaine were given up to 100 times more of a sentence than those who were caught with powder. And the reason we thought that was wrong is because they were looking for crack in certain areas and looking for powder in other areas. And yeah, so really the results of those type of policies where you saw a lot of poor people of color doing a lot of time for being caught with crack, while a lot of suburban people who were wealthier, people who were also involved with drugs, receiving slaps on the wrist for powder. So that's another example of selective enforcement. Our overall mission is drug policy based on science, compassion, and reason. And really what that does is take us out of the propaganda and puts us in a realm where we fight to address harm where harm exists, not looking for harm where it may or may not exist. So to talk about marijuana prohibition, before I went to law school and decided to give myself a lifetime of debt, I was a history student. So, you know, history helps me understand things a lot, so I'll kind of take it back from the beginning. This year, Colorado is celebrating its 90th year of marijuana prohibition. Federally, we're talking about 75 years of prohibition. So a few states moved to prohibit marijuana before the federal government did. And these states were primarily in the Southwest. The situation in Colorado is a prime example. You had long-time Hispanic families who were trying to distance themselves from Mexican migrants. And there was a lot of divisive politics going on. And this Hispanic legislator from Los Angeles County decided it would be politically advantageous for him to push for marijuana prohibition to ensure that even more, is that kind of better? I don't want to get a cricket right now. Maybe I should just go over the podium. But I mean, I think you saw with the initial marijuana prohibition in Colorado, it was self-serving. There was a lot of politics involved. It wasn't really about public health. It wasn't really about marijuana being a problem in society. In fact, at that time, marijuana, even though it was probably still the most commonly used, what we would call illicit substance, it wasn't used at the level that it's used quite now and how it's developed over the last century. But federally, you saw in 1934, right after alcohol prohibition, you saw the introduction of the United States Narcotics Act. This act was meant to combat drug issues in the country. But the reality is, this act was sold as a revenue creator. Once again, it wasn't about public health. It wasn't really about public safety. But this act was sold as something that will generate revenue for states as well as the federal government. And I think we still see that paradigm in play now when it comes to the drug war. The drug war is the reason why we have a bunch of nonviolent offenders in prison. It supports the prison industrial complex. And you can look back to 1934 with the United States Narcotics Act, where this first took place. They first tried to introduce this act, and I think his name was Henry J. Anslinger. He was big in alcohol prohibition. And he was behind this Narcotics Act in 1934. So we end alcohol prohibition. And what did alcohol prohibition teach us? Well, when you make a commonly used substance illegal, you create a black market. The crime syndicate as we know of right now was created thanks to alcohol prohibition. Bugsy Siegel, Al Capone, and so forth. If it wasn't for the prohibition of alcohol, they wouldn't have had large profits to reap from, and we wouldn't have had to deal with the problems that they caused. So basically, we saw that prohibiting alcohol actually caused more problems than alcohol itself. But we did have a problem with drinking. I think we did need a temperance movement in this country at that time, and alcohol prohibition served that. But we wisely ended it in 13 years. So 2 years after alcohol prohibition comes the United States Narcotic Act. When they first tried to release it on the states, only 8 states signed on, so it was a failure. So Anslinger thought, well, what do I need to do to get more states to sign on to this thing? So that's when you saw the Reefer Madness propaganda. So, you saw 2 years of political ads where, the theme was marijuana makes your kids crazy. A man takes an axe to his whole family due to marijuana. Don't let your kids smoke that devil weed that those jazz musicians are dealing with. Louis Armstrong kind of became the poster artist for marijuana prohibition. And you saw then at an early age in prohibition that marijuana was becoming the focal point of that United States Narcotics Act. So after 2 years of reefer madness, they get enough states to sign on to this act. This act becomes law. So we learn early on that marijuana has become the focal point and the meat and potatoes of an early drug prohibition going on in this country. Now, what other substance would be better than marijuana except for maybe coffee or tea if you wanted to have an anti-drug act, because most people were using it. And it is also important to note, I mentioned Louis Armstrong, drug policies in this country have always had certain classes and a certain racist bent to them. In the 19th century, there was something called Lottie, which was basically liquid opium. And a lot of women had problems with this substance in the 19th century. But we didn't decide to ban opium until the Chinese on the West Coast, who came to work on the railroads, all of a sudden started being a part of society. They started opening up businesses. They started to fund laundromats. They started to fund restaurants, believe it or not. And all of a sudden, we had our first opium prohibition because the Chinese had dens where people could go and smoke opium. And so you always see, when you look at the history of drug prohibition and drug laws, you see a certain classist, racist bent to it. Drug laws have always helped when it comes to social stratification and making sure certain people stay in their place and that certain people don't receive too much opportunity too quickly. So we saw that with cocaine prohibition. Cocaine prohibition started in the 20s. That was in New Orleans as well. Louis Armstrong and the folks. That marijuana prohibition started in the Southwest, aimed at Mexican migrants. So when you look at the drug war, you always need to look at that social reality that's going on. And so you fast forward 75 years later, there's 1.8 million arrests for drugs in this country. 800,000 of those are marijuana. 90% of those 800,000 are minor possession. So, 70 years after reefer madness, we still see marijuana is the meat and potatoes of our drug war. We have people going, they may not all go to prison, but they receive labels as a drug offender that sticks with them for the rest of their lives. When you look at the past, I think you see a lot of things that are still current today. Primarily, thanks to reefer madness, the Uniform State Narcotics Act was passed, and 70 years later, you still see marijuana as the epicenter of our current drug war. I'll let Mark talk about what's going on with the medical marijuana, but, federal law, as the gentleman pointed out, classifies marijuana as a Schedule I substance. What that means is it has no medical value, it's highly addictive, and it's highly dangerous. Heroin is a cocaine is a Schedule II substance, which means it's not as dangerous as marijuana. It has certain medical value.
So is methamphetamine.
Methamphetamine is also Schedule II. A lot of poisons are Schedule II, but marijuana is Schedule I. So that shows you that the history that has taken place and the fact that our government, in order to create and implement this revenue-generating act, needed to demonize marijuana. And they still have it demonized at a level that is just almost laughable. The only scientists in the world who claim marijuana has no medicinal value and is highly addictive and highly dangerous are the scientists that work for our Drug Enforcement Agency and the American Medical Association. They're all in cahoots together. But you go to Israel, you go to Europe, you go anywhere else, and they'll be more realistic about the potential harms of marijuana. People can get addicted to anything. You can get addicted to food. So people can use any substance as a crutch. And I'm not saying that people haven't used marijuana as a crutch. And I know a lot of people have people in their family who they want to blame marijuana for that person's problem. But I think we should look beyond the substance and start to look at the broader picture of the family situation and what the character of that person. So as I say, marijuana is a Schedule I substance. It's still the devil weed. Of course, that's the way our government sees it. Our government still sees no problem with arresting or citing nearly 1 million people for minor marijuana possession a year. We are heavily invested in marijuana prohibition as a federal government. This country is. It has been for 70 years. So when you start to ask yourself, why can't we relax on these laws? Why can't we end prohibition? You have to realize that marijuana plays such a pivotal role in our prison system and in the funding of law enforcement. And that's one of the reasons why they don't want to see things change. But you know what? Legally speaking, a state can end marijuana prohibition within their borders. Okay, so don't think that because it's a Schedule I substance federally, that a state cannot provide for its civilians more rights than the federal government does. The only way a state will actually theoretically run afoul of federal law is if they pass a law that says you must smoke marijuana every Tuesday. That is a direct conflict. But to alleviate the criminal penalties associated with use and possession, to set up a tax and regulatory program within a state does not run afoul of federal law per se. You're going to have a bunch of federal attorney generals making arguments that it does. But, from what I remember in the haze of law school, and by the way, the best law students are those that are on pills, basically taking legal meth. They make the best law students, the marijuana smokers. We make the best lawyers, I think. But wow, I really went on a tangent, where was it? Yeah, so I don't think people should be afraid of states trying to end marijuana prohibition and worrying about feds coming in, except for if you're in the medical marijuana system, where you are in many aspects involved in what can be argued large-scale production. But federal agents, the FBI, federal marshals, they don't arrest people for use and possession unless you're on federal property. So if a state allows you to possess a certain amount of marijuana, you don't have to worry about the FBI or federal marshals all of a sudden pulling you over here on Cascade Street and searching you for marijuana. Marijuana prohibition, by and large, is done by state officials with, the banana being put out there by the federal government. The federal government gives states various grants to fill up prisons, various grants to make a certain amount of arrests every year. But the actual, where the rubber hits the road, is with state law enforcement.